Three youths vanished on a bus trip in 1997. A note found in 2021 changed everything. The fluorescent lights of the Greyhound station in downtown Atlanta hummed with an electric tension that December evening in 1997. Christmas decorations hung limply from the ceiling, their cheerful red and gold colors somehow muted by the harsh overhead lighting. Three young friends stood near Gate 7, their excitement palpable despite the late hour. It was just past midnight on December 16th, and the station was quieter than usual, with only a handful of passengers scattered across the worn plastic seats. Sarah Mitchell, 21 years old with auburn hair that caught the light when she moved, clutched her ticket nervously. She had been the one to suggest this trip, convincing her two best friends to join her for what she called the adventure of a lifetime. The Coastal Summer Festival in Myrtle Beach was still 4 days away, but Sarah had insisted they leave early to explore the area, maybe catch some winter surfing, and simply enjoy being young and free. "Are you sure we packed everything?" asked Michael Chen, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he hefted his worn backpack. At 22, Michael was the practical one of the group, always double-checking details and making lists. His parents had immigrated from Taiwan when he was 5, and he carried their work ethic and attention to detail in everything he did. He had been reluctant about the trip at first, worried about missing work at the campus bookstore, but Sarah's enthusiasm had been infectious. The third member of their group, James "Jimmy" Rodriguez, was already bouncing on his heels with barely contained energy. At 20 years old, Jimmy was the youngest, but also the most adventurous. His dark eyes sparkled with mischief as he surveyed the other passengers. "Relax, Mike. We've got everything we need. Besides, it's not like we're going to the moon, it's just South Carolina." Sarah smiled at her friends, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. These two had been by her side through college, through family troubles, through late-night study sessions, and early morning adventures. She couldn't imagine taking this trip with anyone else. "Bus 1247 to Myrtle Beach, now. Boarding at Gate 7, announced the tired voice over the intercom. The sound echoed through the mostly empty station, and Sarah felt her heart skip with anticipation. The bus driver, a heavy-set man in his 50s with graying hair, stood by the door checking tickets. His name tag read Bob Stevens, and he had the weary look of someone who had been driving the same route for decades. He barely glanced up as the three friends approached, their voices a cheerful counterpoint to the drowsy atmosphere. "Tickets, please," Bob said automatically, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone who had said the same words thousands of times before. Sarah handed over their tickets with a bright smile. "We're so excited about this trip. It's our first time to Myrtle Beach." Bob glanced at the tickets, then at the three young faces before him. For just a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Was it concern, warning? But it passed so quickly that Sarah convinced herself she had imagined it. "Find your seats and buckle up," Bob said, handing back the tickets. "It's going to be a long ride." As they climbed aboard, Sarah noticed how empty the bus was. Only about 15 passengers were scattered throughout the vehicle, most of them already settling in for sleep. The interior smelled of disinfectant and something else, something stale and slightly unsettling that Sarah couldn't quite identify. They found seats near the middle of the bus, with Sarah and Jimmy sitting together while Michael took the seat across the aisle. The vinyl seats were worn smooth by countless passengers, and the overhead reading lights cast small pools of yellow light in the darkness. "This is it," Sarah whispered, barely able to contain her excitement. "Our big adventure." Jimmy grinned and pulled out a small camera, one of those disposable ones that were popular in the late 90s. "We're going to document everything," he said, snapping a photo of Sarah's beaming face. The flash illuminated the bus interior for a brief moment, and Sarah blinked away the bright spots in her vision. Michael was already pulling out a paperback novel, but he was smiling too. "You know what? I'm actually really glad we're doing this. My parents think I work too much anyway." As the bus pulled away from the station, Sarah pressed her face to the window and watched Atlanta's lights fade into the darkness. The city gave way to suburbs, then to rural highway, and soon they were traveling through the heart of Georgia in the deep of night. The gentle swaying of the bus was hypnotic, and one by one, the passengers began to doze. Sarah found herself drifting in and out of sleep, her head resting against the cool window. In her drowsy state, she was vaguely aware of the bus making occasional stops, small towns where one or two passengers would get off or on, their footsteps echoing in the quiet night. But it was during one of these half-conscious moments that Sarah first noticed him. He was sitting near the front of the bus, wearing a light-colored suit that seemed oddly formal for a late-night Greyhound trip. What struck her most was how still he sat. While everyone else shifted and dozed, he remained perfectly upright, his hands folded in his lap. In the dim light, she couldn't make out his face clearly, but something about his presence made her uneasy. Sarah tried to shake off the feeling. She was tired, probably imagining things. But as the miles rolled by, she found herself glancing toward the front of the bus more and more frequently. The man never seemed to move, never seemed to sleep. He just sat there, as still as a statue. "Can't sleep either," Jimmy whispered beside her. He had been watching her restless movements. "Just excited, I guess," Sarah replied, though that wasn't entirely true. She didn't want to worry her friends with her strange feelings about the passenger. "In the suit," Jimmy nodded and closed his eyes again. Soon, his breathing became deep and regular. Across the aisle, Michael was fast asleep, his book closed on his lap. Sarah envied their ability to rest. She felt wide awake now, every nerve ending tingling with an awareness she couldn't explain. The bus rolled on through the night, carrying them deeper into the darkness. Outside, the landscape had become a blur of trees and empty fields. Occasionally, they would pass a lonely truck stop or an all-night diner, their neon signs cutting through the black like beacons. It was around 3 a.m. when Sarah noticed they were slowing down. She looked out the window, expecting to see the lights of a town or a rest stop, but there was nothing. Just empty highway and darkness. The bus was pulling off the main road onto what appeared to be a side road or exit. This wasn't on the schedule. Sarah had memorized their route, studied the bus company's timetable. They weren't supposed to stop anywhere until they reached Columbia, South Carolina, and that was still hours away. The bus came to a complete stop in what appeared to be a small roadside area. There was a single building visible in the headlights, a small, run-down establishment with a flickering neon sign that read Pete's Place. The building looked like it had seen better days, with peeling paint and a sagging roof. Sarah's heart began to race. This wasn't right. This wasn't supposed to happen. The bus door opened with a pneumatic hiss, and she watched in growing alarm as the man in the light suit stood up. He moved with a fluid grace that seemed at odds with his earlier stillness. As he passed their row, Sarah caught a glimpse of his face in the dim light, middle-aged, unremarkable features, but there was something in his eyes that made her stomach clench with fear. "Sarah," the man said quietly as he passed. "Michael. Jimmy." The words hit her like a physical blow. He knew their names. This stranger, this man who had sat silently at the front of the bus for hours, knew who they were. Sarah's mouth went dry. She reached across the aisle and shook Michael's shoulder frantically. "Mike, wake up! Something's wrong." Michael stirred, blinking in confusion. "What? What time is it?" "He knows our names," Sarah whispered urgently. "That man, he knows who we are." Jimmy was awake now too, looking around with growing alarm. "What man? What are you talking about?" But before Sarah could answer, the man in the suit was back, standing in the aisle next to their seats. Up close, he was even more unsettling. His face was pale and thin, with deep-set eyes that seemed to hold secrets. His suit, which had appeared light-colored from a distance, was actually a pale gray that seemed to absorb what little light there was. "Time to go," the man said simply. His voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was an underlying firmness that brooked no argument. "Go where?" Michael asked, his voice shaking. "We're not supposed to stop here. Our tickets are for Myrtle Beach." The man smiled, but it was a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Plans change, Michael. You'll understand soon enough." Sarah felt like she was caught in a nightmare. This couldn't be happening. This was supposed to be a fun trip with her best friends, not whatever. This was turning into... "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We don't know you. How do you know our names?" "There's a lot you don't understand," the man replied. "But that's about to change. Now, I need you three to come with me, quietly." Jimmy, who had been silent up to this point, suddenly stood up. "No, we're not going anywhere with you. Driver," he called out loudly. "Driver, there's something wrong here." But when they looked toward the front of the bus, they saw that Bob Stevens was slumped over the steering wheel, apparently asleep. He didn't respond to Jimmy's call, didn't even stir. The man in the suit sighed, as if he were dealing with difficult children. "The driver is fine. He's just resting. He won't be bothering us." Sarah's mind was reeling. Nothing about this made sense. How did this man know their names? Why was the bus stopping at this remote location? And why did the driver seem to be unconscious? "Please," she said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "We don't want any trouble. We just want to go to Myrtle Beach." The man's expression softened slightly, and for a moment Sarah thought she saw something like regret in his eyes. "I know you do, Sarah. And I'm sorry about this. I really am. But sometimes things happen that are beyond our control." "What? Things?" Michael demanded, his voice growing stronger despite his fear. "What are you talking about?" But the man didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device that looked like a walkie-talkie. "Phase 1 complete," he said into the device. 3 packages ready for pickup." Packages. The word sent a chill down Sarah's spine. He was talking about them like they were cargo, not people. "Listen," the man said, turning back to them. "I'm going to give you a choice. You can come with me quietly and no one gets hurt. Or you can make this difficult and things will get unpleasant very quickly. What's it going to be?" Sarah looked at her friends, seeing her own fear reflected in their faces. Jimmy was clenching his fists, and she could see him calculating whether he could fight their way out of this situation. Michael was looking around desperately, probably searching for another exit or a way to signal for help. But there was nowhere to go. They were on a bus in the middle of nowhere, with a driver who was unconscious and a man who somehow knew their names and seemed to be in control of the situation. "What do you want with us?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. The man looked at her with what might have been pity. "That's not for me to explain, but I promise you, if you cooperate, you'll get your answers soon enough." Sarah felt a tear roll down her cheek. Just hours ago, she had been excitedly planning their beach adventure. Now she was trapped in a nightmare that she couldn't wake up from. "Okay," she whispered. "We'll come with you." "Sarah, no," Jimmy said urgently. "We can't just—" "Yes, we can," she interrupted, her voice stronger now. "We don't have a choice." The man nodded approvingly. "That's very wise, Sarah. I knew you were smart." As they gathered their few belongings, Sarah's mind was racing. She had to find a way to leave some kind of sign, some clue about what was happening to them. When the man momentarily turned his attention to Michael, she quickly pulled out a small notebook from her backpack, and scribbled a hurried message. December 15th, 1997. Don't let us continue the trip. The stop at mile marker 209 isn't what it seems. He knows our names. She managed to slip the torn page under her seat cushion, praying that someone would find it someday. It was a desperate gesture, but it was all she could think of in the moment. The man was watching them carefully as they moved toward the front of the bus. "Leave your bags," he said. "You won't need them where you're going." Sarah's heart sank. Whatever was happening, it was clear that they weren't expected to return to the bus. The reality of their situation was beginning to sink in fully. They stepped off the bus into the cold December night. Sarah turned back for one last look at the vehicle that was supposed to carry them to safety. The driver was still slumped over the wheel, and she wondered if he was really just sleeping or if something worse had happened to him. The man in the suit was already walking toward the rundown building, expecting them to follow. Sarah took a deep breath and reached for her friend's hands. Whatever was about to happen, they would face it together. The neon sign of Pete's Place flickered erratically, casting eerie shadows on the empty parking lot. In the distance, Sarah could hear the sound of another vehicle approaching, a van or truck, from the sound of the engine. "This way," the man called back to them, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. Sarah squeezed Jimmy's and Michael's hands tighter. They were walking into the unknown, and she had no idea if they would ever see the sunrise again. But she was determined to be brave, for her friend's sake, if not her own. The building loomed before them, its windows dark and uninviting. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that once they went inside, nothing would ever be the same. The last thing she saw before the door closed. Behind them was the bus, sitting empty and silent in the parking lot like a discarded toy. The December wind picked up, rustling the bare trees that lined the highway. In the distance, a truck horn blared, and then all was quiet again. The bus remained where it was, its passengers gone, carrying with it the mystery of what had happened to three young friends who had only wanted to spend the holidays at the beach. The families knew something was wrong before the bus ever reached Columbia, South Carolina. It was an intuition that mothers carry, a sixth sense that tells them when their children are in danger, even from hundreds of miles away. Margaret Mitchell had woken up at 3:47 a.m. on December 16th with a crushing feeling in her chest, as if someone was sitting on her ribs. She had tried to go back to sleep, telling herself it was just anxiety about Sarah's trip, but the feeling had only grown stronger as the hours passed. By 6 a.m., Margaret was pacing her kitchen in suburban Atlanta, checking the clock every few minutes. The bus should have reached Columbia by now, she thought. Sarah had promised to call from the next major stop, just to let her know everything was okay. But the phone remained silent. David Mitchell found his wife standing at the kitchen window, still in her bathrobe, staring out at their frost-covered lawn. After 25 years of marriage, he knew the signs of Margaret's worry. Her jaw was set in that particular way it got when she was trying to control her emotions, and her hands were clasped so tightly that her knuckles were white. "She's probably just sleeping," David said gently, putting a hand on his wife's shoulder. "You know how bus trips are. She's probably exhausted." Margaret turned to face him, and David saw the fear in her eyes that she was trying so hard to hide. She promised to call David. Sarah always keeps her promises. Across town, Helen Chen was experiencing her own growing panic. She had been up since 4 a.m., unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Michael had been reluctant about this trip from the beginning, only agreeing to go because Sarah had been so excited about it. Helen had respected his decision. He was 22 after all, and needed to make his own choices, but she had made him promise to check in regularly. The last time she had spoken to Michael was at 11 p.m. the previous night. just before he left for the bus station. He had sounded tired but happy, telling her about the festival and their plans to explore the South Carolina coast. He had promised to call when they reached their first major stop. Helen had been watching the clock all morning, calculating travel, times and bus schedules. The route from Atlanta to Myrtle Beach was straightforward, with scheduled stops in Columbia and Florence. Michael should have reached Columbia hours ago. Maria Rodriguez was a woman who lived by routine. She woke at 5 a.m. every morning, made coffee, and read the newspaper before getting ready for work. But this morning, she couldn't concentrate on anything. Her youngest son, Jimmy, was traveling with his college friends, and something felt wrong about the whole situation. Jimmy had been so excited about the trip, talking about it for weeks. He'd worked extra shifts at the restaurant to save money for the adventure, and Maria had been proud of his responsibility and planning. But now, as she sat in her living room with her cold coffee, she couldn't shake the feeling that she should have tried harder to talk him out of going. By 10 a.m., all three families had called the bus company. The customer service representative at Greyhound sounded bored when Margaret called. "Bus 1247 to Myrtle Beach. Let me check the schedule." There was a pause, the sound of typing. "Yes, that bus is running on time. Should arrive in Myrtle Beach at 2:15 p.m. "But they were supposed to call from Columbia," Margaret insisted. "They said they would call, and they haven't." "Ma'am, passengers don't always call when they say, 'They will. I'm sure your daughter is fine. The bus is on schedule.'" Margaret wasn't satisfied with this answer, but she didn't know what else to do. She called Helen Chen, whom she had met at a parent orientation when the kids started college. "Helen? This is Margaret Mitchell, Sarah's mother. I'm calling about the bus trip." Helen's voice was tight with worry. "Oh, Margaret, I'm so glad you called. Michael hasn't checked in either. I've been worried sick." The two women compared notes, their fears feeding off each other. Neither of their children had called, despite promising to do so. Both mothers had that same inexplicable feeling that something was wrong. "Should we call the police?" Helen asked. "I don't know," Margaret replied. "What would we tell them? That our adult children haven't called when they said they would? They'd probably laugh at us." But by 2 p.m., when the bus was supposed to arrive in Myrtle Beach, both families were making more calls. The festival organizers had no record of the three friends checking in. The small hotel where they had made reservations confirmed that the guests hadn't arrived. Maria Rodriguez joined the growing network of worried parents when Helen Chen called her. The three families had connected through their children's friendship, and now they were united in their fear. "Something's wrong," Maria said, her voice breaking. "Jimmy always calls. He's called me every day since he left for college. He wouldn't just disappear." At 3 p.m., David Mitchell called the police. Detective Linda Parker had been with the Atlanta Police Department for 15 years, and she had learned to take missing person reports seriously, even when they seemed premature. The father on the phone was clearly distressed, his voice shaking, as he explained that his daughter and her friends had been traveling on a bus that had apparently reached its destination, but the passengers were nowhere to be found. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand your concern," Detective Parker said, making notes, "but it's only been 15 hours since they left. Young people sometimes change their plans, decide to explore a different area." "You don't understand," David replied. "These aren't irresponsible kids. They're good students, they're planners. Sarah would never just disappear without calling." Detective Parker sighed. She had heard this from dozens of parents over the years. "I'll make some calls, Mr. Mitchell, but I need you to understand that adults have the right to travel and to change their plans. If they haven't been gone for 24 hours, there's not much we can do officially." But David Mitchell was persistent. He had talked to the other families, and they were all reporting the same thing. 3 responsible young adults had seemingly vanished, without a trace. By evening, Detective Parker had made several calls to authorities along the bus route. The Columbia police had no reports of any incidents involving a Greyhound bus. The Florence police said the same thing. The Myrtle Beach police confirmed that the bus had never arrived at its destination. This was when Detective Parker realized they might have a real problem. The next morning, she drove to the Greyhound station in downtown Atlanta to speak with the employees who had been on duty the night before. The station manager, a weary-looking man named Bill Patterson, pulled the records for bus 1247. "Says here the bus left on time at 12:15 a.m., Patterson said, scanning the paperwork. Driver was Bob Stevens. He's been with the company for 23 years, never had a problem. "Where's Mr. Stevens now?" Detective Parker asked. "Should be starting his route back to Atlanta. Bus 1247 is supposed to return today at 4 p.m. But when 4 p.m. came and went, there was no sign of bus 1247 or Bob Stevens." The bus company's Atlanta office was in chaos. Regional manager Tom Brady had been with Greyhound for 30 years, and he had never faced a situation like this. A bus and its driver had simply vanished, along with several passengers. "We're tracking the bus through our GPS system," Brady told Detective Parker. "The last signal we received was around 3:30 a.m., somewhere in rural Georgia. Then nothing." "What could cause the GPS to stop working?" Detective Parker asked. Brady shrugged. "Mechanical failure, dead battery, someone deliberately disabling it. Could be anything." Detective Parker was beginning to understand that this was no simple case of young people changing their travel plans. A bus, its driver, and multiple passengers had disappeared without a trace. This was unprecedented. The families were beside themselves. Margaret Mitchell had taken time off work and was spending her days calling hospitals, police stations, and anyone else who might have information about her daughter. She had created a missing person flyer with photos of all three friends, and she was distributing them to businesses along the bus route. Helen Chen was doing the same thing, driving to small towns in Georgia and South Carolina, showing photos. To gas station attendants and diner waitresses, she had convinced herself that if she just kept looking, kept asking questions, she would find some clue about what had happened to Michael and his friends. Maria Rodriguez was perhaps the most heartbroken of all. Jimmy was her youngest, her baby, and the thought of him being in danger was almost too much to bear. She had taken a leave of absence from her job as a school secretary to focus entirely on finding her son. The three families had formed a support network, talking daily, sharing information, and holding each other up through the darkest days of their lives. They had hired a private investigator, a former police detective named Robert Hayes, who specialized in missing persons cases. Hayes had been working missing persons cases for 20 years, and he had never seen anything quite like this. The disappearance was too clean, too complete. In his experience, when people vanished, they left traces, credit card usage, phone calls, sightings. But Sarah, Michael, and Jimmy had simply evaporated. Someone planned this, Hayes told the families during one of their weekly meetings. This wasn't random. The timing, the location, the complete absence of evidence, this was orchestrated. The words sent chills through the room. Margaret Mitchell felt her world shifting beneath her feet. "What are you saying? That someone kidnapped them?" Hayes chose his words carefully. "I'm saying that 3 young people and a bus driver don't just disappear without help. Someone wanted them to vanish, and they had the resources to make it happen." As the weeks turned into months, the investigation hit one dead end after another. The bus company had been cooperative, but their records showed nothing unusual about the route or the passengers. The driver, Bob Stevens, had no history of misconduct or criminal activity. The GPS system had malfunctioned, but the company's technicians couldn't determine why. Detective Parker had expanded the investigation, working with police departments across multiple states. She had interviewed every passenger who had been on similar routes, every employee who had worked at the bus station that night, every person who might have seen something suspicious. But the three friends had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. The families refused to give up. Margaret Mitchell had mortgaged her house to pay for the private investigator and to fund their search efforts. Helen Chen had organized search parties, driving to remote areas where the bus might have been hidden. Maria Rodriguez had started a blog and a social media campaign, sharing photos and information about her son and his friends. But as 1998 turned into 1999 and 1999 turned into 2000, the leads dried up. The police investigation was scaled back, though it remained officially open. The private investigator had exhausted his resources and delivered his final report. The three friends had most likely been murdered, though their bodies might never be found. The families were devastated by this conclusion, but they refused to accept it. They continued their search, continued their campaign, continued to hope that someday they would get answers. Years passed. Margaret Mitchell's hair turned grey, then white. Helen Chen developed chronic insomnia, unable to sleep. Without wondering if Michael was safe somewhere, Maria Rodriguez aged a decade in the span of a few years, the stress and grief taking their toll on her health. But they never stopped looking. They never stopped hoping. They never stopped believing that someday, somehow, they would find out what had happened to their children. The case became a local legend, the subject of newspaper articles and television specials. The families welcomed the attention, hoping that publicity might generate new leads. They appeared on talk shows, gave interviews to journalists, and cooperated with documentary filmmakers. But the coverage eventually faded. New tragedies captured the public's attention. The disappearance of Sarah Mitchell, Michael Chen, and Jimmy Rodriguez became a cold case, relegated to a file folder in Detective Parker's desk drawer. The families, however, continued their vigil. They met every month, on the anniversary of the disappearance, sharing memories and supporting each other through their grief. They had created a scholarship fund at the local college, honoring their missing children by helping other young people pursue their dreams. Margaret Mitchell had turned her daughter's bedroom into a shrine, keeping everything exactly as Sarah had left it. Helen Chen had done the same with Michael's room. Maria Rodriguez had framed Jimmy's last school photo and hung it in her living room, where she could see it every day. They had learned to live with their loss, but they had never learned to accept it. Deep in their hearts, they all still believed that someday, somehow, their children would come home. And then, in September 2021, 24 years after the disappearance, a brown envelope arrived at the offices of a small newspaper in Savannah, Georgia. The envelope had no return address, and the postmark was smudged beyond recognition. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of yellowed paper, torn from what appeared to be an old notebook. The handwriting was rushed and shaky, as if written in extreme stress or fear. At the top of the page, in faded ink, was a date: December 15th, 1997. Below that, in the same trembling handwriting, were the words that would change everything. Don't let us continue the trip. The stop at mile marker 209 isn't what it seems. He knows our names. The newspaper editor who received the letter, a veteran journalist named Patricia Williams, initially thought it was a hoax. But something about the paper, the ink, the desperate tone of the message made her take it seriously. She called the police. Within 48 hours, the case that had been cold for more than 2 decades was suddenly the hottest investigation in Georgia. Detective Parker had long since retired, but she was contacted by the current investigating officer, Detective James Morrison. When she saw the letter, she felt a chill run down her spine. "This changes everything," she told Detective Morrison. "If this is genuine, it means they knew something was wrong. It means they tried to leave a message." The letter was rushed to the FBI crime lab for analysis. The paper was indeed from the late 1990s. The ink matched what would have been available at the time, and the handwriting showed signs of stress and fear that would be nearly impossible to fake. Most importantly, the letter contained details that had never been made public. The date was 1 day before the disappearance, and the reference to mile marker 209 was specific and precise. Detective Morrison began the process of re-examining the case with fresh eyes and new technology. DNA analysis had advanced significantly since 1997, and digital forensics could now analyze evidence that had been impossible to process decades earlier. But the most significant development was the renewed hope it gave to the families. Margaret Mitchell, now in her 70s, wept when she heard about the letter. Helen Chen, who had battled cancer twice in the intervening years, felt a surge of energy she hadn't experienced in decades. Maria Rodriguez, who had been caring for her elderly mother while battling her own health problems, suddenly had a reason to keep fighting. "She's still trying to help us," Margaret said, holding a copy of the letter with trembling hands. Sarah is still trying to come home. The letter had been written in Sarah's handwriting. The FBI had confirmed it by comparing it to samples from her college notebooks. Somehow, in the moments before she disappeared, Sarah had managed to leave a message for her family. The question now was whether anyone would be able to decode what she was trying to tell them. Detective Morrison had studied the case files extensively, and he knew that mile marker 209 was not on any official bus route. But he also knew that sometimes buses made unofficial stops, and that drivers sometimes deviated from their planned routes. The investigation was about to take a turn that no one could have anticipated. Detective James Morrison had seen enough missing persons cases to know that most cold cases stay cold. Evidence degrades, witnesses disappear, and the truth gets buried under layers of time and forgotten details. But Sarah Mitchell's letter had breathed new life into a case that had haunted him since he joined the Georgia Bureau of Investigation 5 years earlier. Morrison was a methodical man, the type who believed that every mystery had a solution if you were willing to dig deep enough. He had requested the original case files from the Atlanta Police Department, and he had spent weeks studying every interview, every piece of evidence, every dead-end lead that had been pursued in the months after the disappearance. The letter had given him something concrete to work with, mile marker 209. But when he consulted highway maps from 1997, he found that mile marker 209 was in a stretch of rural Georgia highway where no bus stops were scheduled. The nearest official stop was 40 miles away. Morrison decided to take a drive. Highway 441 stretched through some of the most desolate parts of central Georgia, cutting through pine forests and small farming communities that seemed frozen. In time, mile marker 209 was located in a particularly isolated section where the road curved around a series of low hills and the trees grew thick on both sides. Morrison pulled his unmarked car onto the shoulder near the mile marker and got out to look around. The area was quiet except for the occasional truck rumbling past. There was no sign of any commercial establishment, no indication that buses had ever stopped here. But as Morrison walked along the edge of the highway, he noticed something that made his pulse quicken. About 50 yards from the mile marker, barely visible through the trees, he could see the remains of what appeared to be a small building. The structure was almost completely overgrown with vines and vegetation, but Morrison could make out the outline of what had once been a roadside establishment. He pushed through the undergrowth, ignoring the thorns that caught at his clothes, and found himself standing in front of the ruins of what had clearly been a small restaurant or bar. The building was barely standing. The roof had partially collapsed, and the walls were covered in graffiti and years of weather damage. But Morrison could still make out the faded remains of a sign, Pete's Place. Morrison felt a surge of excitement. This was it. This was the place that Sarah Mitchell had been trying to tell them about in her letter. But why had 3 young people been brought here? And what had happened to them after they arrived? He spent the next hour carefully examining the ruins, taking photographs and making notes. The building had clearly been abandoned for years, but Morrison could see evidence that it had once been a functioning business. There were remnants of tables and chairs, a broken jukebox, and what appeared to be the remains of a kitchen. But it was what Morrison found in the back room that made his blood run cold. Hidden under a pile of debris, he discovered a small metal box. Inside the box were several items that made his hands shake as he handled them. A college ID card belonging to Michael Chen, a small silver bracelet that would later be identified as belonging to Sarah Mitchell, and a disposable camera that still contained undeveloped film. Morrison called for backup immediately. Within hours, the site was swarming with crime scene technicians, FBI agents, and investigators from multiple jurisdictions. The ruins of Pete's Place were carefully excavated, and every piece of evidence was catalogued and analyzed. The disposable camera was rushed to the FBI lab for processing. The film was old and degraded, but technical specialists were able to recover several images. The photos showed the interior of a bus, 3 young people smiling and laughing, and what appeared to be other passengers in the background. But it was the final image on the roll that provided the most crucial evidence. The photo was blurry and poorly lit, but it clearly showed a man in a light-colored suit sitting near the front of the bus. His face was partially obscured by shadows, but there was something unsettling about his posture and the way he seemed to be watching the camera. Morrison knew he needed to track down everyone who had been connected to Pete's Place when it was still operational. County records showed that the business had been owned by a man named Pete Kowalski, who had died in 2003. But Morrison was able to locate Kowalski's former employees through old tax records and social security files. The most promising lead came from a man named Eddie Dawson, who had worked as a night shift clerk at Pete's Place in the late 1990s. Dawson, now in his 70s, was living in a trailer park about 30 miles from the ruins of the establishment. When Morrison knocked on Dawson's door, the old man's face went white. "I was wondering when someone would finally come asking about that night," he said quietly. Dawson invited Morrison inside and offered him a cup of coffee. The trailer was small and cluttered, filled with the accumulated possessions of a long life. Dawson's hands shook as he poured the coffee, and Morrison could see that the man was struggling with memories he had tried to forget. "I knew this day would come," Dawson said, settling into a worn recliner. "I should have said something years ago, but I was scared. Hell, I'm still scared." Morrison set up his recording equipment and began the interview that would crack the case wide open. "Tell me about December 16th, 1997, Morrison said. Dawson closed his eyes and was quiet for a long moment. "That was the night everything changed. I was working the overnight shift like I always did. Pete's Place wasn't much, but it was a decent job for an old guy like me. We got truckers mostly, a few travelers who needed to stretch their legs. Did you see a bus that night?" "Yeah, I saw it. Big Greyhound bus pulled up around 3:30 in the morning. That was unusual. We weren't an official stop, you understand. But sometimes drivers would pull over if they needed a break or if passengers needed to use the facilities." Morrison leaned forward. "What happened when the bus stopped?" Dawson's voice became quieter. There was this man, well-dressed guy in a light suit. He got off first, then he went back on the bus. A few minutes later, he came back out with 3 young people, 2 men and a woman. They looked scared, confused. Can you describe the man in the suit? Middle-aged, maybe 50 or so, thin, pale. There was something cold about him, if you know what I mean. The kind of man who makes you uncomfortable just by being in the same room. Morrison's pulse was racing. This was the first eyewitness account of what had happened to Sarah, Michael, and Jimmy. What did the man do with the 3 young people? Dawson rubbed his face with his hands. This is the part that's been eating at me all these years. The man, he knew their names. He called them Sarah, Michael, and Jimmy. But they acted like they'd never seen him before in their lives. Did they go into the restaurant? No, that's what was so strange. There was another vehicle waiting, a van or maybe a small truck. The man led the 3 kids to the vehicle and they all got in. The whole thing took maybe 10 minutes. Morrison felt his heart racing. What happened to the bus? The bus driver, he just sat there the whole time. Didn't get out, didn't try to help, just sat behind the wheel like he was asleep or something. After the van left, the bus driver got out and came into the restaurant. He ordered a cup of coffee and sat at the counter for about an hour. Did he say anything? Not much. I tried to make conversation, but he wasn't interested. The only thing he said was that he had orders to keep quiet about the stop. Said his supervisor had told him that some stops weren't official and weren't supposed to be reported. Morrison was taking detailed notes. Did you ever see the man in the suit again? No, never. But I'll tell you something. I had the feeling he'd been watching the restaurant for a while. Like he knew the bus was going to stop there, like it was all planned. Nah, why didn't you report this to the police? Dawson's voice broke slightly. I was scared. The next day, Pete got a phone call. Someone told him that it would be better for everyone if we forgot about what happened that night. A few weeks later, Pete told me he was closing the restaurant, said he'd gotten an offer to sell the land that was too good to refuse. Morrison felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Who bought the land? I don't know. Pete never told me. But I got the impression that he was scared too. He closed the restaurant and moved to Florida. I heard he died a few years later. Morrison spent another hour with Dawson, getting every detail the old man could remember. The story was consistent and believable, and it provided the first real breakthrough in the case. But Morrison needed more. He needed to find out who had been behind the disappearance, and he needed to discover what had happened to the 3 young people after they left Pete's place. His next step was to track down Bob Stevens, the bus driver. Stevens had retired from Greyhound in 2010, but Morrison was able to locate him through pension records. Stevens was living in a small apartment in Macon, Georgia, and when Morrison called to request an interview, the old man's voice was filled with dread. I've been waiting for this call for 24 years, Stevens said. The interview with Stevens took place at the local police station, with Stevens' lawyer present. The former bus driver was in his 70s now, his health failing, and Morrison could see that the man was carrying a heavy burden of guilt. I want to tell you everything, Stevens said, his voice barely above a whisper. I should have said something years ago, but I was scared. They threatened my family. Stevens' story corroborated Dawson's account, but provided crucial additional details. The bus driver revealed that he had been approached by his supervisor, a man named Carl Brennan, several days before the trip. Brennan had given Stevens specific instructions about making an unscheduled stop at mile marker 209. Brennan told me that there would be a passenger on the bus who would identify himself when it was time to get off, Stevens said. He said it was a matter of national security, that I wasn't supposed to ask questions. Morrison felt a chill. National security. That's what he said. He showed me some kind of official-looking document, but I couldn't tell if it was real or not. He said that if I followed orders and kept quiet, my family would be safe. If I didn't... Stevens didn't finish the sentence, but Morrison understood the implication. What happened to Carl Brennan? He died in a car accident in 2005. Single car crash, hit a tree. But I always wondered if it was really an accident. Morrison was beginning to see the outlines of a conspiracy that went far. Beyond a simple kidnapping, someone with significant resources and influence had orchestrated the disappearance of 3 young people, and they had been willing to kill to keep their secret. But who were they? And why had they targeted Sarah, Michael, and Jimmy? The answer to that question would come from an unexpected source: the FBI's cold case database. Agent Patricia Valdez was a specialist in human trafficking and organized crime. She had been assigned to assist Morrison with the investigation, and she had been running the names of the missing students through federal databases. "I found something," Valdez told Morrison during a meeting at the FBI field office in Atlanta. Michael Chen's father worked for a defense contractor in the 1990s. He had security clearance and access to classified military technology. Morrison felt his pulse quicken. What kind of technology? Communication systems, satellite tracking, GPS, technology, the kind of stuff that would be very valuable to foreign intelligence services. Are you saying that Michael was targeted because of his father's work? It's possible. But there's more. I found records showing that Dr. Chen reported suspicious contact from unknown individuals in the months before his son disappeared. He thought someone was trying to recruit him as a spy. Morrison felt the case taking on a new dimension. What about the other 2, Sarah and Jimmy? I'm still investigating, but it's possible they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. If someone was planning to abduct Michael, they might have taken his friends to avoid leaving witnesses. The investigation was now being handled as a matter of national security. FBI agents were interviewing everyone who had been connected to Dr. Chen's work, and intelligence analysts were trying to determine which foreign government might have been behind the operation. But Morrison was troubled by one aspect of the case. If this had been a foreign intelligence operation, why hadn't the abductors simply taken Michael and left his friends alone? Why had they taken all 3? And why had they apparently held them at Pete's place? The answer to that question would have to wait. Morrison had more pressing concerns. He needed to find out what had happened to the 3 young people after they left Pete's place, and he needed to determine whether they were still alive. The investigation was about to take another dramatic turn. Dr. Helen Chen had never stopped believing that her son was alive. Through 24 years of sleepless nights, false leads, and crushing disappointments, she had held on to the hope that Michael would somehow find his way home. When Detective Morrison called her in October 2021 to tell her about the breakthrough in the case, Helen felt a mixture of hope and terror that she hadn't experienced since the early days of the investigation. "Mrs. Chen, I need to ask you about your late husband's work," Morrison said gently. He was sitting in Helen's living room, surrounded by photo albums and scrapbooks documenting Michael's life. "We have reason to believe that Dr. Chen's position at Lockheed Martin may have been connected to your son's disappearance." Helen's hands trembled as she reached for her cup of tea. "David always said his work was sensitive, but he never talked about it much. He said it was better if I didn't know the details." "Can you tell me about any unusual contacts your husband had in the months before Michael disappeared?" Helen closed her eyes, trying to remember. "There were phone calls, strange calls at odd hours. David would answer and then hang up immediately. He said it was probably wrong numbers, but I could tell he was worried." Morrison leaned forward. Did he ever mention feeling like he was being watched or followed? Yes, Helen said quietly. In the weeks before Michael's trip, David became very paranoid. He would check the locks on the doors multiple times before bed, and he started varying his route to work. He even bought a gun, which was completely unlike him. The pieces were beginning to fall into place for Morrison. Dr. Chen had been involved in the development of early GPS satellite technology, work that would have been extremely valuable to foreign intelligence services. It appeared that someone had been pressuring Dr. Chen to share classified information, and when he refused, they had taken his son as leverage. But Morrison still needed to find out what had happened to the three young people after they left. Pete's Place. The investigation had expanded to include multiple federal agencies, and intelligence analysts were working around the clock to identify the foreign operatives who might have been involved. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A former CIA operative named Richard Hawthorne, who had been working undercover in the 1990s to identify foreign spy networks operating in the United States. Hawthorne, now in his 70s and suffering from early-stage dementia, had been following the news coverage of the reopened case. He contacted the FBI through his former handler, claiming to have information about a Soviet intelligence operation that had been active in Georgia in the late 1990s. The Russians were desperate for American technology, Hawthorne told Morrison during a meeting at a secure facility in Quantico. They had identified several defense contractors who were working on sensitive projects, and they were using every method they could think of to get access to classified information. Morrison showed Hawthorne the photograph from the disposable camera, the image of the man in the light suit. Hawthorne studied the photo carefully, his eyes narrowing with concentration. "That's Viktor Petrov," Hawthorne said finally. "He was a GRU operative, military intelligence. Very skilled, very dangerous. We'd been tracking him for years." Morrison felt his pulse racing. What was his specialty? Recruitment and coercion. He was particularly good at identifying people's vulnerabilities and exploiting them. If he couldn't convince someone to cooperate, through bribery or blackmail, he would use their families as leverage. The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. The disappearance of Sarah, Michael, and Jimmy had been orchestrated by Russian military intelligence as part of an operation to steal American military technology. But Morrison still had the most important question: were the three young people still alive? That answer came from a source that no one had expected. Margaret Mitchell received a phone call in November 2021 from a woman who identified herself as Dr. Sarah Mitchell. "Mom?" The voice was older, weathered by years of hardship, but Margaret recognized it immediately. "Mom, it's me. It's Sarah." Margaret collapsed into a chair, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. "Sarah, is it really you? Where are you? Are you okay?" "I'm okay, Mom. We're all okay. Michael and Jimmy are here with me. We've been waiting for the right time to come home." Through tears of joy and disbelief, Margaret learned that her daughter and her friends had been held captive for more than 2 decades in a remote facility in northern Canada. They had been kept alive because their captors had hoped to use them as ongoing leverage against Dr. Chen and potentially other family members. "They told us that if we ever tried to escape, or if anyone ever found us, they would kill our families," Sarah explained. "We've been waiting all these years for the right moment, for some sign that it was safe to try to get away." The news coverage of the reopened investigation had been their sign. Sarah, Michael, and Jimmy had been allowed limited access to news and media over the years, and they had seen the reports about the discovery of Pete's Place and the identification of Viktor Petrov. "We realized that if the FBI knew about Petrov, maybe they could protect our families," Sarah said. "So we decided to take the risk. Didri. The three friends had managed to escape from their captors during a prison transfer. They had been moved periodically over the years to prevent them from becoming too familiar with any one location. During the most recent move, they had overpowered their guard and fled into the Canadian wilderness. "We've been walking for 3 days," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "We found a small town with a phone booth. Michael and Jimmy are here with me, and we're all okay, but we're scared. We don't know if it's safe to come home." Morrison coordinated with Canadian authorities and the FBI to arrange for the safe return of the three friends. Within hours, they were in protective custody, being debriefed by intelligence agents and receiving medical attention. The reunion scenes were emotional beyond description. Margaret Mitchell, now 73 years old, held her daughter for the first time in 24 years. Helen Chen, weakened by cancer treatment but strengthened by joy, embraced her son and wept tears of relief. Maria Rodriguez, who had never stopped believing that her Jimmy would come home, was almost speechless with happiness. But the three friends had been changed by their ordeal. They were now in their 40s, their youth stolen by their captors. They had been kept in isolation for much of their captivity, allowed only limited contact with each other and no contact with the outside world. Sarah had become a doctor during her captivity, forced to provide medical care to other prisoners and to their guards. She had used her medical knowledge to help keep her friends healthy and to treat their injuries when they were punished for disobedience. Michael had been forced to use his intelligence and technical skills to help his captors with various projects. He had sabotaged their work whenever possible, but he had been careful not to get caught. He had also helped plan their eventual escape, using his knowledge of electronics to disable security systems. Jimmy had become the group's emotional anchor, using his natural charisma to maintain morale and to negotiate with their captors for better treatment. He had also been the one who had convinced the others that they should try to escape when the opportunity arose. The three friends had supported each other through the darkest years of their lives. They had shared their memories of home, their hopes for the future, and their determination to survive. They had become more than friends. They had become family. "We never gave up hope," Sarah told her mother during their first private conversation. "We always believed that someday we would come home, and we never stopped loving you." The intelligence operation that had destroyed their lives was finally exposed. Viktor Petrov had been killed in a car accident in Moscow in 2008, possibly eliminated by his own government to prevent him from revealing secrets. The facility where the three friends had been held was raided by Canadian authorities, but most of their captors had fled. Dr. Chen had died in 2019, never knowing that his son was alive. But Helen Chen was able to tell Michael that his father had never stopped searching for him, had never given up hope that he would come home. The three families had been reunited, but the healing process would take time. The friends needed extensive therapy to help them readjust to life in the outside world. They had missed decades of technological advancement, social changes, and personal milestones. But they were alive. They were home, and they were together. The case had consumed Detective Morrison for months, and he felt a deep satisfaction in seeing it resolved. But he also felt a profound sadness for the years that had been stolen from these three young people and their families. "This case changed my understanding of what families go through when their loved ones disappear," Morrison said in a conference. The strength and determination of these families, their refusal to give up hope, that's what ultimately brought these three people home. The story of Sarah, Michael, and Jimmy became a symbol of hope for families dealing with missing loved ones. They had survived against impossible odds, and their return had proven that sometimes miracles do happen. But the case also served as a reminder of the hidden costs of international espionage and the innocent people who become casualties in the shadow wars between nations. Sarah Mitchell, now Dr. Sarah Mitchell, decided to dedicate her life to helping other families dealing with missing persons cases. She established a foundation that provided support services and resources to families in crisis. Michael Chen used his technical skills to develop new technologies for tracking missing persons and improving communication between law enforcement agencies. He also worked with the FBI to identify and disrupt human trafficking networks. Jimmy Rodriguez became a counselor, helping other trauma survivors rebuild their lives. He also worked with the families of missing persons, using his own experience to provide hope and support. The three friends remained close, their bond strengthened by the shared trauma of their captivity. They had lost their youth, but they had gained something perhaps more valuable, the absolute certainty that they were loved and that their families would never give up on them. Margaret Mitchell, now in her 70s, finally had her daughter back. Helen Chen, despite her illness, was able to spend her remaining years with her son. Maria Rodriguez, who had never stopped believing, was able to watch her youngest son rebuild his life. The case had taken 24 years to solve, but it had been worth the wait. Three families had been reunited, an international conspiracy had been exposed, and the truth had finally been revealed. The investigation had also revealed the importance of never giving up hope, of continuing to search for answers even when the odds seem impossible. Sarah's letter, written in desperation and hidden under a bus seat, had ultimately led to the breakthrough that brought her and her friends home. The bus stop at mile marker 209 was finally quiet. Pete's place had been demolished, its ruins finally cleared away, but the memory of what had happened there would live on as a reminder of the courage of three young people who had survived against all odds, and of the families who had never stopped believing in their return. As this story comes to an end, we're reminded that behind every missing person case is a family that refuses to give up hope. Their strength, their determination, and their love are what ultimately bring their loved ones home. If this story has touched your heart, please take a moment to share it with others. Hit that subscribe button if you want to hear more stories of hope and survival. Leave a comment below telling us about your own experiences with never giving up on the people you love. And remember, sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply keep believing, keep searching, and keep hoping. Because sometimes, against all odds, the people we love do come home.